So now you have an airframe with 4 motors and 4 propellers generating thrust to fly your quadrotor. But before we can talk about how to control the vehicle, it's important to understand the behavior of the propulsion system, which is to say, how these 4 motors at the end of each of the arms of the quadrotor actually function to move the vehicle around. The first thing to remember is that most quadrotors have fixed pitch propellers. What that means is that for a given revolution per minute, or RPM, each prop will produce a fixed amount of thrust. The faster the propellers spin, the more thrust. If the vehicle is completely level in the air, and all 4 props are spinning at the same speed, just fast enough to bounce against gravity, you're hovering. If, however, you want to go somewhere, then you need to spin some of the props faster than others to produce more thrust. If one of the props starts to spin a little faster, then it'll produce more thrust at the end of that arm relative to the other 3, and will act like a lever and cause the vehicle to tilt a little bit. Now you have all 4 rotors producing thrust, but on a tilted vehicle. So the overall thrust is at an angle. With only a slight tilt, most of the thrust being produced is being used to keep the vehicle in the air, but some of that thrust, by virtue of being pointed to one side, is actually going to cause the vehicle to accelerate in that direction. But here we have to pause for a moment and note that if you only increase the thrust on one motor, you would also introduce a net torque around the vehicle, which would cause the vehicle to start to spin, which would complicate things. So really, the way you induce motion on a quadrotor, assuming you don't want to spin, is to increase the thrust on 2 adjacent motors that are spinning in opposite directions. This way, you change the balance of thrust without introducing a net torque around the vehicle. So the way that you get a hovering quadrotor to start to move in one direction or another is that you increase the thrust on 2 motors on one side of the vehicle such that it tilts and starts to accelerate away from the faster rotating propellers. If you want the vehicle to slow down, then you slow down the propellers that had more thrust, and you increase the amount of thrust on the opposite motors. Now it's like an opposing lever that's being pushed up. The vehicle will start to pitch backwards and will start to decelerate.